that it should not surprise us that a Jewish apostate and a recent convert to Christianity disproved of Jewish physicians. Antonius Margherita claimed that the Jews from German lands, Bohemia and Hungary, unlike the Sephardi and Italian coreligionists, had never seen, let alone read, Avicenna, Galen, nor Hippocrates and the like in the Hebrew translation in their lifetime, and even less so in Latin. He furthermore stated that he relied only on little booklets written in Hebrew characters with some knowledge of herbs and roots, which they heard or learned from their fathers and grandfathers. End of the quote or paraphrase. Although polemical works targeting Jewish physicians have a long history, Nicolin Hortitz, John Ephron, and Udo Benzenhofer and others argued that in the 16th and 17th centuries, its Central European iterations included both new tropes and new actors integrating such a text into their rhetoric. The concern with the Jewish inaptitude to read and write Latin, their supposed inability to write recipes legible for apothecaries, and their artisanal educational background form a novel and in the German Jewish context, somehow peculiar set of anxieties, which were uttered no longer by theologians and converts, but embraced and amplified by practicing physicians as well. These passages written by Margherita, for instance, were adopted by Georg Pictorius. Other physicians, Paracelsus, Philip Begadi, Adam Lonissa, Ludwig Hoenig, and others also articulated similar arguments as a way to persuade Christian patients to refrain from Jewish readers. As much as they preoccupy with Jews, these physicians also worried about apothecaries' ability to prepare drugs, about women's preference for female healers, about the uncontrolled distribution of remedies by various practitioners of dubious background. Behind these thickly drawn lines between the honorable physician and the quote-unquote quacks emerges a rather blurred process of collective occupational identity building, which elevated, according to Claudia Stein, at first Galenism, but later also other university-driven traditions, into the physician's civic identity. The restructuralization of healthcare in the 16th and 17th century German towns was driven by the insertion of the physician's expertise into the government. Its expansion over the public matters then resulted in the strengthening oversight over the urban medical care. The archival studies of greater Jewish communities, such as Frankfurt, suggest that the burden of the oversight was met with both resistance and warm participation by Jewish medical practitioners. Yet the evaluation of its effects on their skills, knowledge, and practices rest on the hypothesis that any emerging gaps in their knowledge and education could have been mended thanks to Italian universities, which opened their enrollment for Jewish students of medicine. The studies of the ghetto's academization, nevertheless, show that it was a slow process that never uprooted apprenticeship, but its familial and communal dimensions. Therefore, there remains a large portion of practitioners about whom we know close to nothing. In this paper, I would like to bring the attention to Yiddish translations and adaptations of German and on occasion Dutch and Latin medical books, materials that began as an act of active reading and eventually materialized as written Yiddish text, penned by a diverse group of Ashkenazi healers, from university graduates to men and women who learned their occupation via apprenticeship. This study had been enabled by the ERC-funded project JUTAC, Jewish Translation and Cultural Transfer in Early Modern Europe, led by Dr. Iris Idelson-Schein, which maps the Jewish translational endeavors across languages, genres, and geographies, and enabled us, Dr. Idelson-Schein and me, to undertake research which parts are presented here. The Yiddish translations of medical works offer more than a window into the libraries of the Ashkenazi medical practitioners. These materials reveal the cultivations of book-related skills, shed light on the mechanisms of deriving, translating, modifying, and organizing medical knowledge, and allow us to trace the transformation of the physician's persona through the various languages and their remnants captured by Jewish scribes and authors, vis-a-vis the changing social and intellectual environment informing the practice, and vis-a-vis the Jewish readership that these books targeted. The very existence of Yiddish and also Hebrew works based on other vernacular and on occasion Latin books attest to the fact that Jewish healers or Ashkenazi healers were actively reading books published by contemporary physicians. Some of the manuscript copies, moreover, divulge that the Jewish copies were equally capable in employing the Latin and Latinized script. A particular example is offered by a Yiddish manuscript copy of Andreas Vesalius, hugely famous, De Humanis Corporis Fabrica Epitome, which was first published in Basel, together with Epitome's German translation prepared by the rector of the University of Basel, Alban Thorer. The anonymous scribe into Yiddish preserved both the German syntax and terminology of the source, along with the visual distinction between German and Latin. The German text was rendered in standard Yiddish cursive, leaving out spaces for the Latin terms. The scribe then filled in the blanks with the humanistic Latin script, although he abandoned the practice later in the process of copying. The Yiddish copy of Lorenz Fries, hugely popular as Spiegel der Arznei, also mixes Yiddish cursive with the Latin one. The copyist Moses Jacob had it preserved for his father-in-law Solomon ben Yoetz in 1583. The scribe's sudden change in scripts reveals that Solomon did not commission the book's translation due to his inability to read it on the original. Such was the case of an early 18th century midwife from Amsterdam, who commissioned a Yiddish translation of a Dutch midwifery manual studied by Jordan Katz to overcome her own inability to read Dutch. Moses ben Jacob's copy of Spiegel der Arznei rather mediates the access to the book, where its Yiddish rendition was a convenience or a cultural choice. In case of recipes, the Latin rendition preserved either on the level of the script or the language, then subjected to transliteration, soon became necessity and resulted in the linguistic hybridity of Yiddish medical books, common to other vernacular medical pharmacology. In spite of the pharmacy's urban and mercantile character, Latin was adopted as a language of its business, or at least its technical aspects. Apothecaries were subjected to municipal scrutiny, but also became the dominant and verified producers and sellers of complex medicaments, forcing licensed healers and lay healers whose Latin was often limited to adopt the language, at least for writing out recipes. By extension, Jewish practitioners became mediators and interpreters of this linguistic reality to their Jewish communities. Moses Benjamin Wolf, a 17th century learned physician from Kalish, and the author of Yerushat Moshe and Yoel Moshe, for instance, advised the following, quote, when someone suffers from a bloody cough, do the following. Take what is called in the apothecary trochisli de terra sigilote, it's an equivalent for Latin trochiscorum de terra sigillata, and then take it with rose water, end of the quote. Such rendition, as Moses clarified in the preface, ensures that the patients will find the medicaments because, quote, the apothecary called materia medica everywhere the same name, so you will not fail to find it, end of the quote. Latin had not lost its symbolic value as a traditional language of scholarship, in spite of the long history of vernacular technical literature in German-speaking realm. Latin signposted erudition. In such manner, it was also, and perhaps especially, employed by medical practitioners not associated with the university. Prague-based surgeon Issachar Teller was a well-established practitioner who continued his father's tradition and even briefly apprenticed with Joseph ben Solomon del Medico of Candia, a famed Jewish physician active across Central and Eastern Europe. In his Be'er Ma'im Chaim, Taylor printed Del Medico's Hebrew translation of Hippocrates' aphorisms along with the set of tested and verified recipes and advice on how to live healthy. So the second part, the recipes were his contribution to the work. And in spite of this very practice-oriented choice of the genre, Teller's use of Latin terminology often went beyond pharmacological appellations. It included further technical terms such as dies caniculares, the names of the diseases such as asthma, catarrh, dysentery, and so on, and even listed brief Latin phrases. His remedy against plague, for instance, reads primum remedio fugo. Many of the often mentioned books and manuscripts were utilitarian in nature, Although we may attribute this tendency to Yiddish as a marker of popular culture, these materials equally reflect the practice-oriented nature of medical services provided by Central and Eastern European Jewish physicians. This lens informed not only the sources they selected to translate, it is equally imprinted on social texts that in their original form stirred out of other medical genres and forms of scholarly writing. To illustrate such a case, I have to take you further east. Published anonymously in 1613, Sefer Derech et HaChaim is the earliest and for a long time the only printed medical work in Yiddish known to us. The book's title page makes no mention of its author, sources, or place of publication, but recent studies have taught us something about the book's provenance, suggesting that it was a work of an Eastern European learned physician published in or around Lublin. Yiddish scholar Eva Geller has furthermore suggested that the book is an adaptation of the medieval rhymed health manual known as Regimen Sanitatis Salernitanum. Our own research confirms that the Sefer Derech et HaChaim is indeed an adaptation related to the Salernitan regimen, but it is neither an original adaptation nor the revolutionary proto-Maskalic text Geller understands it to be. In fact, the book is, for the most part, a translation of two distinct 16th century Latin texts, the Conservanda Bora Valetudine by Johannes Curio, town physician and professor of medicine at Erfurt, and Pietro Andrea Mattioli's famous commentary on the Materia Medica of Dioscorides. The concealment of sources was not unusual for this type of work. Our own research at JUTAC has indicated that the lack of acknowledgement was a common practice among Yiddish writing Jews, basing themselves on non-Jewish sources. Moreover, such a translational norm became an established form of writing among early modern Jewish physicians writing in Jewish languages, regardless of their cultural background. A 17th century Jewish graduate of the University of Rome, Jacob Zahalon, relied for his own Hebrew medical work, Otzar HaChaim, on the Latin works of learned physicians such as Daniel Sennett and Lazare Riviere, without mentioning them at all. In a 17th century Judeo-Spanish autograph written in Istanbul, Lola Ferre has identified passages translated from Gabriel de Fonseca's Medici o Economia, where the author did not mention their source, in contrast to the acknowledged translation of the Arabic canon of Ibn Sina, also included in the same manuscript. And the 16th century Ashkenazi Jewish Hillel Eliezer Arbuk even employed the same strategy of concealment on the medieval Latin to Hebrew translations that had been already circulating in Hebrew for almost 2 centuries. In a similar manner, these physicians all erased any mentions of contemporary authors and the authors of lesser importance mentioned in the source text. As a result, texts originally teeming with scholarly references are reduced to references to Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, occasionally including also Maimonides, Paul Agineta, and Al-Razi. The system of auctoritates, authorities worth mentioning, conveys the statement that the Jewish Hillels were a part of a long and well-established scholarly medical tradition at the expense of the fact that some of their very sources were far more critical to both the Arabic authorities as well as the classical masters. In such a manner, the author of Sefer Derech et HaChaim got rid of any academic paratext and theoretical discussions. Curio's book constituted a lengthy exegesis on the comments on Salernitan regiment written, edited and commented by Arnaldus de Villanova, who set the golden standard for the genre in its more academic rendition. And Mattioli's book systematized the scholarly thought on medicinal plants while basing himself on the classical pharmacologist Dioscorides. In the Latin rendition of the Salernitan regimen, the Salernitan regimen is absent, and so are Villanova's editions. The translator into Yiddish extracted only the practical advice given by Curio, the same editorial choices that inspired the translator treatments of Mattioli's work. Although celebrated as one of the pinnacles of medical humanism, meticulously marking various appellations of medical plants and herbs, their looks, the place of their growth and characteristics, The translator into Yiddish preoccupied with the plant's practical uses only. In doing so, he molded his translation of Hebrew Latin scholarly text into a text resembling a popular Yiddish recipe book, the likes of which would have been familiar to Jewish readers of the time, the likes of which have been already mentioned in this paper on several occasions. And that brings me to the very first quote that appeared at the beginning of this paper, to the vilified Kreuterbuch, passed down from grandfathers to fathers and their sons. This Latin to Yiddish translation and adaptation of medical materials powerfully busts the myth of the Ashkenazi medical book's insularity. It reveals its pan-European connections as a book that reflects the contemporary scholarship, and it is a product of its own times, along with its Ashkenazi specificity. This particular propensity for the practical seems to have been a characteristic feature of Yiddish translation of scientific texts, including arithmetic, as is the case of Haida's Maaseh Cholesh Koshev or Pinchus Melechet Machshevet, and geography as exemplified by Moses ben Abraham Telaot Moshe or Kronebuch's Curioser Antiquarius. The same phenomenon has been also noted in Hebrew to Yiddish translations, into which, as Chavatoriansky observed, and here I quote, no substantial theoretical deliberations, philosophical, theological, mystical, or ethical enter, end of the quote. Gravitating towards apothecaries and markets, these early modern scientific texts reveal their truly urban nature. They thus foreshadow that to further understand skills, literacies, and practices that enabled the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe to remain in a dynamic dialogue with the surrounding societies, including their institutions of governance and health provision, we have to look closely and inspect the location of these knowledge transfers with its cultural, social, and lived complexities. Thank you.